In conversation with Susan Beth Miller. Susan Beth Miller lives in Ann Arbor, Michigan, where she works as a clinical psychologist. She is the author of three novels, including Indigo, Rose, and a Beautiful Land, and five psychology books, including When Parents Have Problems, Shaming Context and Emotion of Menace and Enchantment. She loves the natural world, original ideas, heart, democracy, and dogs of all breeds. And on today's episode of Auto Interview, it's my utmost pleasure, joy and excitement to have on the show today, Susan Beth Miller. How are you doing, Susan?
I'm doing well, Peter. Hope you are, and
I'm
thank you for having me today. Pleasure to be
absolutely.
here.
I'm so excited, really, to have you on the show today. I've been looking forward to this. I'm excited we're finally here to talk about your lovely books. Thanks for coming on. So, Susan, I want to first say congratulations on your newly released young adult novel in the name of By the Way I Love You, which I found to be quite compelling, absorbing, and interesting. And I would like to ask you, how does this book come about? What inspired you to write By the Way I Love You?
Good question, Peter. Yeah, each book starts from a different seed, a different place of origin.
Mm,
I believe this one actually started from my work as a psychologist, which is the other hat that I wear. So, quite a number of years ago, I was working with a young person in my office who was just starting college. It happened to be a young man, although the book centers on a young woman. But the part of the experience that stayed with me had to do with the fact that this young person had lost his mother to illness uh, a number of years before he started college. And though he wasn't really consciously thinking about his mother much at all when he came to see me. He was having a lot of difficulty making that transition into this new phase of early
yeah.
adulthood. And I was able to, as I was listening to him, see the kind of fingerprints of the earlier loss in
Mm,
his present day experience. So it was that experience for me that started me down the road of thinking about, okay, what is the baggage that a person might bring with them when they make a big developmental change in life? It
mm,
might be going to college, it might
yeah.
be joining the military, or just leaving home to take a job. When you take those leaps forward, you also bring with you some things from the past, that are packed in your bags, right? And come along. And so in this book, I was exploring how some of the things the character brought in her bags,
Wow.
her psychological bags, were affecting her efforts to um, embrace her new life as
Mm.
a young adult in college.
Oh, wow, this is actually a very fun introduction into becoming a writer, and I really love it actually when I read through it. It's such an amazing one. I'm invested in the amazing characterization that it has and the lovely point of views, the storyline, the transitioning. It's quite beautiful to me, really. And I need to say you've done a great job with the storytelling.
Thank
It's a
thank you,
great way
Peter.
you've got
Thank you.
in there.
Appreciate that.
Thank you. And for the sake of readers who haven't read the book yet, and without giving much information away, could we have a sneak of what you'd expect in terms of themes and subject lines picking up the book?
Sure, sure. Yeah. Well, this at the center of the book is a young woman. Her name is Leslie. She's just arrived at a big university in the middle part of the United States.
Well,
Um, and she is getting ready to meet her new roommate. She doesn't know anything about this person. And
wow.
so you see her meeting new people. Some of them she takes to, others she does not like. And she
Oh,
has to find her way with all these very ordinary experiences of meeting new people, starting classes, exploring her sexual wishes, all these ordinary young adult experiences are on her menu. But she also brings her prickly personality. She's not an easygoing person. She's got a lot of rough edges. So, she's trying to make her way using the personality, the strength she has, but also some of the weaknesses she has. And so the reader goes on some adventures with her new friends, following her here and there in her life. And as the story goes, some other threads come into it. There's an environmental thread because she becomes invested in trying to protect a piece of land that has a lot
Mm,
of meaning for her. Um, she has lost her mother, and she feels a lot of concern about the way she treated her mother, the way she behaved with her toward the end of her life. So, in a sense, she feels like she failed to protect and nurture her own mother, but when she becomes invested in this piece of Mother Nature, the phrase we use to talk about the earth, she can see that here's maybe a chance for her to be a stronger person, a better person, a more caring person in defense of Mother Nature, but she has to develop some strengths and some courage in order to be that person. So part of
mm,
the journey is her learning to speak up, to have some boldness and courage. And she finds different people along the way that help her. Sometimes they help her, sometimes they hinder her, but she has to, develop all those relationships.
mm. This is such an amazing one, really. I love your take on it. Been fun so far, and your response is quite great. Thank you so much for sharing with us. Thank you. And there's this other title of yours that I found a description page on Amazon as well. Were quite compelling. And that's the one titled Emotions of Menace and Enchantment. Would you like
Uh,
to tell us a bit about the making of that as well?
yeah, sure. Yeah, I was laughing because I think of the books that I've written in psychology and then
Oh,
also in fiction.
yeah.
That was the title that I liked the best.
Oh,
So I
it's a
thought it was
compelling
my
title.
favorite title.
Yeah.
Yeah. So interesting that you ask about that one. But that is one of the psychology books. I had written a series of books on particular emotions. So the
Mm,
first one was called The Shame Experience.
mm,
There's a second one also on shame, and then there was one book on disgust called Disgust, the Gatekeeper Emotion. So, with the book that you asked about
yeah.
called Emotions of Menace and Enchantment, in that book, I tried to take a group of emotions, an array of emotions, including disgust, which I discussed earlier, and also horror, and then two emotions that people enjoy feeling. So one is fascination, the other is awe. And I was looking at some of the relationships among these four emotions. Of course, each one is distinct, each one
Mm,
is different from the others, but there's also some threads that carry through them.
mm,
So one lens that I was looking through or point of view
yeah.
had to do with boundaries around the self experience because that's an interesting perspective for looking at emotions. For example, if you look at disgust,
Mm,
disgust is an emotion that really uh, draws a boundary around a person and says, "This is me, that's you, go away." Stay outside, stay away from
wow,
me. And it could be something physical like bad food or a bad substance, or
wow.
it could be uh, political. Like, I don't like the way those people think. I'm going to say I'm definitely separate from them. So
Mm.
disgust is very kind of ferocious in forming that boundary. But other emotions deal with boundaries in their own way. So, say with awe, that experience that people don't have too often, but when they have it, they remember it. It's wonderful. And in
Mm.
awe, there's not much of a boundary around the self. We just join the universe. We kind of forget about the self and pay attention to what's beyond us and bigger than us.
Wow.
So each emotion is looked at, through that lens of what happens with this boundary around the self.
Hmm. Well, I love your take on that. Sounds to me to be quite amazing, to be quite great and quite fun. Before we proceed, I'd like you to show to the camera the copy of the first book we talked about. That's
The, the
The Way I Love
novel,
You. Yeah.
yeah, oh, sure, I can show
Yeah.
that.
Beautiful cover
Yeah,
you've got even
the
in there.
cover.
Would you
Yeah.
like to talk about the making of the cover? I love the look of it.
The cover, it's a collaborative effort. At
Yeah.
least that's my experience between me and the publisher, and then the publisher has a graphic designer.
Mm.
So I had a few ideas about elements from the book that might appear on the cover, and
Mm.
then the graphic designer makes a few um, proposals, and we think,
Absolutely.
about which one we like the best,
Yeah.
make some changes. So in this case, there's an image of a person in a hoodie, a hooded sweatshirt, and that's an element from the story.
Yeah.
I thought it was also a good choice because the hoodie covers the person quite a bit. And
Mm.
Leslie, the main character, is kind of hidden at the beginning. She's fearful, so she hides. So the hoodie, which is dark, seemed to fit, but
Yeah.
also on the cover, you can see coming out from inside the image of the hooded person are branches and flowers and butterflies, and
Mm.
that also picks up a theme from the book because as the book progresses, she becomes more interested in the natural world,
Yeah.
and all these nature images are all nature is within her. So
Yeah, I love the take of that. And I like you as well to show to the camera the copy of Emotions of Menace and Enchantment if you have a copy of it there with you.
have it. Can
Yeah.
you see that?
Oh,
Okay.
wow.
So it's yeah,
Oh, this
a
is a
little
beautiful
different cover.
cover.
Yeah.
What
It's
inspired
a
you to make a cover like this?
it was a sculpture. I came across an image of this sculpture. I think it was actually, I have to look it up again, in Russia or Ukraine.
Oh, wow.
I just liked the face. It seemed a little an interesting facial expression, maybe picked up on some of the content of the book. So yeah, it just spoke to me. That one came from me, not so much from the publisher.
I love it too.
Some publishers are very engaged with you, others are less so. In that case, the publisher was not so engaged, so I was
Oh,
doing more on my own.
interesting. Thank you for sharing. Thank you.
Yeah.
And Susan, one of the most
Uh,
interesting things to me as a writer is to listen to readers' feedbacks. And you may want to agree with me that one of the things that make literature to be complex in its entirety is the fact that it can be interpreted in different ways by different readers based on their opinions. And sometimes the readers might get the message intended by the author, sometimes they might be close to getting the message, sometimes they might be far from
yeah.
getting it, and sometimes
Yeah.
they might hilariously misunderstand the message and interpret the book upside down, you know. And as interestingly fun as they sound, I would like to ask you, how do you feel when readers interpret your works differently than you intended? How does that make you feel?
My guess is that poets have that experience more than novelists,
Marvelous.
that with poets, you could probably, have an enormous range of interpretations. It's a little more subtle with a novelist.
Yeah.
The main experiences I've had along those lines were when I was working on a book and not completed, not
Mm.
published, and sharing it with a writing group. So a group of colleagues, friends that are interacting around it,
Yeah.
as you're developing it. And in those cases, it's actually extremely helpful. You want to hear, did I get this point across? Did I get this character across? And sometimes you didn't, and then you want to do some more thinking about um, what you've written. Now, in other cases, a person would say, well, that's not realistic, or I didn't like that character. And I'm thinking, I don't want it to be realistic. I don't want you to like that character. So that's okay.
Mm.
Maybe the reader wants to like the character, but that might not be my goal. So it depends on what your goal is. I know with this present book, the young adult book, I've had a range of reactions to the main character. Some people are finding the character hard to like, she's too rude or she's not very well behaved. So that didn't bother me.
Yeah.
It is part of who she is. So.
I appreciate, I love your take on that, and I like the fact that you mentioned that with poetry, it's something that we experience oftentimes because it always have different interpretation. Yeah, and that compared to
Yeah,
the novels. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, and with poetry, I might read a poem and love it, and if you ask me what it meant, I might not quite be able to tell you
Yeah.
because poetry is so emotional. It evokes the feeling, sensations, rhythms.
Absolutely.
Translating it into prose
Yeah.
is not very easy,
Yeah.
Um,
Absolutely.
and sometimes that's excellent poetry that you
Yeah.
can't really easily translate into prose. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing. Thank you. I'd also like to ask you, Susan, how does your work as a psychologist interact with your fiction writing? How did you become interested in writing? I'm curious, you know.
Well, I've been interested in writing for such a long time, and really before I was interested in psychology or had any idea what a psychologist was, I was interested in writing, from childhood. So that actually came first. I do think that two kinds of work, they have things in common. They feed each other in certain ways.
Mm,
Certainly, at the center of each is human beings and, character, right? Characters.
mm,
So when you work as a psychologist, you're, trying very hard to get to know the complexities of a particular human being,
yeah.
and doing that helps you build characters when you're writing.
Mm,
When you're in the office interacting with someone, you have such a great opportunity to hear their stories,
mm,
but not just the content of their stories. You hear the way they tell their stories, how they use language. Do they talk with their hands like I do a lot? Um, you know, how do they relate to the physical space they're in? Are they interested in everything that's on the wall, or they don't care at all? They just pay attention to you. So you see all those individual details and variations. And of course, that's the way you build characters on the page too, is with all that individual individuality.
Mm.
So there is that nice connection, between the two.
Wow. I love your take on that. That is quite very great, quite amazing, and quite lovely. And I'd actually like to ask you, because I myself have always been surprised and fascinated by how authors, especially novelists like yourself, would sit down and craft long sentences and bring words together in a way that sentence make paragraph and paragraph makes pages, and pages make chapters, and eventually a great novel. And this always leaves me thinking, how exactly did they got the idea to sit down and
Oh,
craft this long sentence, this long pages, this long paragraph in a way that an amazing, huge, voluminous book is formed eventually. Now, as far as writing is concerned, I'd like to ask you, how exactly did you get your inspirations and ideas? Where did they come from? I'm curious, you know.
yeah. Usually for me, some interaction that I've had with another person,
Mm,
or it might be with a story in the news, but something that my thing that seems complicated. It's got multiple layers, so I'm trying to understand, to wrestle with it in some way,
mm,
to understand the relationship between the parts, or um, as I said, it might be, there have been times when it was something in the news that was both troubling and interesting at the same
uh,
time. And I'm trying to think about it. And then as I'm thinking about it, I start to think maybe that's something you could explore in fiction. So
mm.
travel down that road.
That's amazing. That is quite compelling, and that is very great. I love the sound of
Yeah.
it because I get to think that so many people get inspiration from different ways. When I get to ask some people,
Yeah.
like, yeah, well, I get inspiration from my real life experiences. I get inspirations from stories of friends or family members. I get inspirations from what I've seen around me happening in the society. I get inspiration hilariously sometimes from the dreams I have when I go to bed at the night to sleep. And
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
always a
Yeah.
very fun and exciting way with which to everybody and every writer it differs. The source of inspirations differ.
Yeah. Yeah.
The source of human well of ocean of ideas where it's coming from differs from one person to another. I love hearing about
Absolutely.
yours.
Yeah.
Thanks for sharing.
Yeah. I got one example that I could give is many years ago,
Yeah.
I had heard a news story, and it was about, do you know who the South African dissident Stephen Biko was?
Yeah, I think I heard
It's a
about the
long time,
name.
but he was a very well-known young man, very impressive, and he had been imprisoned during the
Wow.
apartheid era for his
Wow.
activism, right? And he died in prison. And I think the regime said it was,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. And now, apart from the newly published, by the way, I Love You, and your other previous publication, do you have any other works you've authored or say currently working on?
Yes, I'm currently working on a novel. Got a long way to go with that. I also have a few novels that I completed and have not published. So any publishers out there interested, I could talk to you about that.
Yeah.
And also some children's picture books for little children that I've written, haven't published those at this point. So quite a bit, yeah, that's completed, or one that's in the works. Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting, really. I love your take on that. That's a very, very great one. Now, could you tell us what publishing is like for a published author like yourself? Are there any challenges you've encountered in the process of writing your books and also ever since it got published?
Publishing is challenging. It can be hard to find a publisher that wants to publish the kind of work that you do.
Yeah.
Uh, I've had a range of experiences. I've had traditional publishers like Random House, um, and traditional publishers that publish my psychology books.
Mm,
The last two novels, including this recent one, I published with a hybrid publisher, which is a kind of a newer model. And in some ways, that's been the best experience I've had. They're very nice to work with, very engaged and involved, but it is a different model from the traditional publishers. The downside of the hybrid publisher or self-publishing is that it's very hard to have your books in a bookstore. They're available easily online, but if you want to see it in your local bookstore, that's hard to accomplish unless you have the traditional publisher.
yeah, that's very true, really. Thank you for sharing.
So I guess if I, sorry, say,
I said that again, sorry.
I was going to say if I was starting out with a new manuscript, I might try the traditional publishers first. If you can't get what you are, if you can't find somebody to publish it through the traditional route, there are these
Yeah.
other routes which are definitely worth exploring.
Interesting.
But first, write the very best book you can.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much for sharing. I love the sound of it. And as a published author, I'd like to hear your advice. What sort of advice do you offer other writers who are still struggling with publishing a book? And where exactly can interested readers get a copy of your book?
Well, I guess I'll go back to write the best book you can. Uh, and be humble. You might think it's
Mm,
completed when it still needs a lot of work. Be willing to work with a good editor. A
absolutely.
wonderful editor is extremely valuable. So listen to other people's feedback
Yeah.
and and then with respect to my book, it's available easily online. You could get either an ebook or a physical book. If you want the physical book, you can
Yeah.
go to bookshop.org, which is
Yeah.
independent booksellers,
Mm,
or of course Amazon, Barnes and Noble. Another thing I like to remind people, if you don't want to buy a book and you have a library near you, sometimes the library, if you ask them, can buy the book.
mm.
So that's another way to get a book.
Yeah. I love your take on that. That's a great one you've mentioned in there. Thank you so much. And I left a link also in the description part of this interview where interested viewers can get a copy of Susan Miller book directly on Amazon, and Barnes& and Nobles, on our website, and also another platform. I also left a link to our social media pages for possible followings. So thank you so much, Susan, for accepting the invitation to be featured on P English Literature. I must say it's more than awesome, quite exciting, very great having you on the show today. I've been looking forward to it and I'm excited when we finally do it. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you, Peter. My pleasure.
Yeah, it's my pleasure as well.